The steel factory smelled like rust and old blood. Kang Jae-min sat in a chair with his wrists zip-tied behind him, one eye swollen shut. A cut above his jaw that had stopped bleeding an hour ago and started again when he turned his head. The chair was bolted to the floor. Someone had planned this room. 3 men stood behind him, his own brother's men, people who had eaten at his table. Kang Min-suk walked in through the far door without hurrying. He was wearing a gray suit. He looked like he was coming from a board meeting, which, Jae-min knew, he probably was. Min-suk buttoned his jacket as he crossed the concrete floor. He pulled a chair from against the wall, turned it around, and sat on it backwards, arms folded across the top. He looked at his older brother for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "You look terrible." Jae-min said nothing. 2 years, Min-suk said. "We looked. Not hard, I'll admit, but we looked." He tilted his head. "Where did you go?" Still nothing. Min-suk nodded slowly, like a man confirming something he already knew. He stood, straightened his jacket again, and walked to the room's single window. Outside, the factory yard was dark. No lights on the road, no sound. "She's still in the building, you know," he said. "Your wife, mopping floors. She came in at 11 tonight. She always comes in at 11. He turned around. "I used to find it sad, now I just find it useful. She keeps the marble very clean." Jae-min looked at him then, just looked. And Min-suk, who had spent his entire adult life learning to read his older brother's face, felt something he had not expected to feel in this room. Afraid. He covered it fast. He turned back to the window. "Hyun-woo wants to do this tonight. I told him we had time." He paused. "I was wrong. We don't, do we?" Jae-min said, "Check your watch." Min-suk frowned. "What?" "Check your watch. Tell me what time it is." Min-suk looked at his watch. 1:14 a.m. From somewhere outside, far away but getting closer, something that sounded like engines. Multiple engines. Moving fast. "Before we go on, let me ask you something quickly. If your own family stole everything you built, would you forgive them or make them regret it? Share your answer in the comments. And if you enjoy gripping stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. Go back 18 months. Go back to a hotel conference room in Nairobi, Kenya, on a Tuesday afternoon in March, when Kang Jae-min was 37 years old and had not yet made the single most important decision of his life. The conference was a regional security summit, private sector, invitation only, the kind of gathering where the right handshake in the right corridor was worth more than anything said on the main stage. Jae-min was there because 3 of his logistics partners were being circled by a cross-border financial crimes investigation, and he needed to understand how close the walls were. He sat in the 3rd row of a side panel on regulatory compliance, the most boring panel of the day, by design, which meant only serious people attended, and the woman presenting the case study on asset concealment and international exposure was someone he had never seen before. She stood at the front of the room like she had built it. No notes, no slides for the first 10 minutes. She just talked, and the room, which was full of men who talked for a living, went quiet and stayed quiet. Her name was Zariah Cole. She was a Malawian attorney representing a coalition of 3 East African governments. She was 32 years old. She had co-authored the legal framework that had resulted in the freezing of $400 million in concealed assets across 4 jurisdictions in the past 18 months. She was, in other words, exactly the kind of person Kang Jae-min was supposed to avoid. He stayed for the whole panel. He found a reason to be in the corridor when it ended. He introduced himself, and she shook his hand, and she said, "I know who you are," in a tone that was neither impressed nor hostile. Just informed. The way a chess player acknowledges a piece on the board. He asked her to dinner. She said no. He asked again the following morning. She said, "Why?" He said, "Because you're the most interesting person at this summit, and I'd rather have an honest conversation over food than a dishonest one in a corridor." She thought about it. She said, "I'll give you 1 hour." They talked for 4. By the end of the night, he had not touched his food. She had eaten everything on her plate and finished his bread. She asked him questions that no one in his professional life asked him, questions about what he actually believed, what he had built and why, what he was afraid of losing. She didn't soften the questions. She didn't apologize for them. He answered all of them. He did not pursue the investigation after that. He called his partners and told them they were on their own. They were furious. He didn't care. 6 months later, he asked her to marry him in a restaurant in Seoul. She said, "You understand what you're asking. Your family, your world, the way people will look at us." He said, "I don't care about any of that." She said, "I do, not because it frightens me, because I need to know you've thought about what it costs." He said, "I've thought about nothing else for 6 months." She said yes. The wedding was in February. The chandeliers were real crystal. The flowers were flown in from Cape Town. The 3 brothers sat in the front row and applauded at the right moments and said the right things to cameras, and Kang Min-suk shook Zaraya's hand at the reception and told her she was welcome in the family. He was already planning. What the brothers knew about Jae-min's empire was the part he let them see. The Kang Group was legitimate on its surface. Real estate across Seoul, Busan, and Singapore. A private security firm with government contracts. A logistics network that moved cargo through 6 Asian ports. Profitable. Clean enough to withstand audits. The kind of company that got invited to charity galas and had its chairman photographed with ministers. Below that surface was something else. Offshore accounts in Geneva, Dubai, the Cayman Islands. A shadow network of operatives, former intelligence officers, retired military, people who owed Jae-min debts they could never repay in money. Encrypted communication systems. Asset structures so layered that the company's own CFO could only see 3 levels down. Min-suk knew some of this. Hyun-woo knew less. Do-yoon, the youngest, knew almost nothing and preferred it that way. What none of them knew was that 3 weeks before the helicopter, Jae-min had spent an afternoon in a private room at the Kang Group's Busan facility with his most trusted operative, a man named Park Sung-jin who had been with him since they were both young and broke and making bad decisions in Incheon. Jae-min sat across from Sung-jin and told him what he believed was coming. He said, "My brothers are going to move. I don't know when, I don't know the exact shape of it, but Min-suk has been meeting people I don't recognize, and the meetings stop when I enter the room, and that's the only information I need." Sung-jin asked him what he wanted to do. Jae-min said, "I'm going to transfer everything. The real architecture, the offshore accounts, the network loyalty codes, the encrypted ledger access, the identities of every operative who actually answers to me. All of it." Sung-jin waited. "To Zaraya," Jae-min said. Sung-jin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She's a lawyer." "She's her father's daughter," Jae-min said. "And she's smarter than both of us." "If something happens to you..." "When something happens to me," Jae-min said, "she'll have everything they don't know exists. They can take the company, they can take the building, the board seats, the accounts they can see, but the real foundation, she'll hold it." He paused. "And she'll know what to do with it?" Sung-jin asked how he could be sure. Jae-min said, "Because I've watched her read a room full of powerful men and walk out knowing things about each of them that they hadn't intended to share. She doesn't miss anything, she never has." The transfer happened over 3 sessions. Legal documents restructured through attorneys in Zurich and the Cayman Islands. Digital access transferred through encrypted channels. Sung-jin personally briefed the 6 operatives at the top of the network and told them, if Jae-min was gone, they answered to one person. Zaraya never asked him why he was doing it. She sat across from him in their apartment on the last night, both of them at the kitchen table with cold coffee, and she looked at the documents and then at him. She said, "You think they'll actually do it?" He said, "I think Min-suk has been planning this since our father's funeral." She said, "And you're not going to stop it." He said, "I need to know who moves. I need to know who helps them, who stays quiet, who looks the other way. If I stop it now, I only stop this version. They'll find another way. But if I let it happen..." "You flush them all out," she said. He said, "Every one of them." She looked at him for a long time. She said, "If this goes wrong..." He said, "It won't." She said, "Jae-min." He said, "I know." The helicopter went down on a Thursday evening in April, over the Yellow Sea. The explosion was reported at 7:42 p.m. Coast Guard found wreckage within 2 hours. By midnight, the Kang Group's communications team was managing press. By the following morning, Min Suk had already called an emergency board session for Monday. The man in the helicopter was Kang Jae-min's bodyguard and closest personal security detail, a former Marine named Choi Bum-suk who had spent 11 years keeping Jae-min alive. He had volunteered, not because Jae-min asked him. He had come to Jae-min 3 days before and said he understood what was needed and that he wanted to be the one. Jae-min had told him no 4 times. Bum-suk had said, "You pulled me out of a prison in Macau with 3 phone calls and no guarantee you'd succeed. I've been waiting 7 years to balance that account." They didn't shake hands after Jae-min finally agreed. They sat in silence for a few minutes. Then Bum-suk stood up, said he had things to arrange, and left the room. Jae-min did not watch him go. The funeral was held 8 days later. Seoul's elite turned out because they always turned out. The Kang Group's lawyers ensured the death was legally certified within the week. Madame Kang stood at the grave in an immaculate black coat and wept in a way that looked completely real. Zaraya stood 3 feet to Madame Kang's left. She wore black. She held flowers she had chosen herself, white ones, the kind Jae-min's mother had kept in the apartment where he grew up, a detail Zaraya had learned from a photograph he once showed her and never mentioned again. She did not cry at the grave. People noticed. People commented. People said, in lowered voices at the reception afterward, that she seemed cold, that you could never really know what people from other places felt or how they showed it. Zaraya heard all of it. She remembered all of it. She filed it away in the same place she filed everything. On the 5th day after the funeral, Kang Hyun-woo came to the apartment. He didn't call first. He brought 2 men with him who waited in the corridor, which told Zaraya everything about what kind of visit this was before he opened his mouth. She let him in. She offered him water, he declined, which she expected, and walked into the center of the living room and stood there like he was measuring it. He said, "The board met this morning. There are some legal matters that need to be resolved." She said, "Sit down, Hyun-woo." He didn't sit, he said. "The joint accounts have been placed under review pending the estate process. That's standard. The company's attorneys will be in touch with whatever representation you arrange." She said, "The company's attorneys are my attorneys." He said, "Actually, that arrangement ended this morning. The firm works for the Kang Group. The Kang Group's leadership has changed." He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. He set it on the coffee table without looking at her. "The company owns this apartment. We'll need it back within 30 days. There's a severance offer inside, which we think is more than fair given the length of the marriage." Zaraya looked at the envelope. She didn't pick it up. Hyun-woo pulled something else from the other side of his jacket. Gray fabric, folded once. He dropped it on top of the envelope. A uniform, janitor's overalls, a small logo on the breast pocket. The Kang Group's building management division. He said, "The cleaning staff is always short-handed. Night shift, 11 to 5. The pay is decent. It's not charity. You'd be earning it." He straightened his jacket. "We thought it was better than nothing." He said it like he was doing her a favor. He said it looking directly at her, so she would understand that he knew exactly what he was doing. Zaraya looked at the uniform on the coffee table. Then she looked at Hyun-woo. Her face did not change. Her hands were still. She reached out and picked up the uniform. She said, "I'll start Monday." Hyun-woo left. His 2 men followed him out. The door closed. Zaraya stood in the middle of the living room holding the uniform for a moment. Then she walked to the window. Seoul spread out below her, 32 floors down, lights moving, the city completely indifferent. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she had memorized and never saved. When the call connected, she said, in a low, even voice, "It's started. I'm going to need the equipment." 3 days later, a cleaning supply delivery arrived at the building's service entrance. Standard order: mops, buckets, industrial cleaner. The manifest was accurate. The invoice was real. Inside the base of one of the industrial mop buckets, wrapped in protective foam, were items that had not been ordered through the cleaning supply company. A secondary phone, encrypted, with a secure satellite relay. 3 microcameras, each the size of a fingernail. A signal duplicating device, no larger than a deck of cards, capable of mirroring data from any device within a 3-foot radius. A listening unit so sensitive it could record a conversation through 2 inches of drywall. The equipment had been sourced and delivered by a man named Emmanuel Diallo, who had spent 22 years as a field operative under General Isaac Cole of the Malawian Defense Intelligence Service. Diallo was 61 years old, retired, and living in Nairobi. He answered his phone on the second ring when Zariah called. He asked no questions. He said, 3 days, and hung up. Zariah's father had raised her to understand one thing above all others. He said it to her when she was 14, sitting across from him in a safe house in Blantyre while rain hit the tin roof, and he said it the way men like him said important things. Once, plainly, without decoration. He said, "The most dangerous person in any room is the one no one is watching." Monday night. 10:47 p.m. The building's executive floors were quiet by 10. Security rotated at 11. The cleaning staff moved through on a schedule that Zariah had memorized in her first week. Which corridors were checked, which elevators the guards used, which cameras had the longest intervals between sweeps. She pushed her cart through the corridor outside Minsok's private office at 11:34 p.m. The door was locked. She had a master key. Building maintenance staff had master keys. Nobody had thought about that when they handed her the uniform. Inside the office, she worked fast. The listening device went into the base of the desk phone. The micro camera went behind the ventilation plate above the credenza. 4 screws, 60 seconds, plate back in place. The signal duplicator went under the lip of Minsok's laptop charging station, where it would silently copy every device that came within range. She was back in the corridor in under 9 minutes. She moved to the next office. In Heinwu's office, she found something she hadn't expected. A printed document, face up on the desk, partially covered by a folder. She photographed it without touching it. The document was a communication record, a transcript of a conversation between Hyunwoo and a government minister named Choi Dae-jung, who oversaw Port Authority operations in Busan and Incheon. The conversation referenced shipments, it referenced payments, it referenced a video. She photographed all 4 pages. She went back to her cart. She mopped the corridor outside both offices. At 3:15 a.m., she took her break in the staff room on the basement level, where there were no cameras, and spent 40 minutes transmitting the night's data through the encrypted phone to a server in Zurich that only 2 people in the world could access. She got back to her cart at 3:57. She finished her shift at 5 a.m. She rode the service elevator down with 2 other members of the cleaning crew who nodded at her and talked about a television show. She nodded back. She took the bus to the reassigned apartment the company had moved her to after reclaiming the penthouse, a 2-bedroom in a district 40 minutes from the office. She sat at the kitchen table and opened her laptop and began reading. Across the city, things were going wrong for the brothers. Minsok's most trusted weapons broker, a Taiwanese national named David Shen, who had operated across East Asia for 15 years without a single public exposure, was found by Korean federal agents at 6 a.m. on a Wednesday in his Gangnam penthouse. Alive, fully cooperative, with a look on his face that suggested someone had reached him before the agents did. Every transaction record, every encrypted communication, every offshore trail connecting David Shen to the Kang brothers. All of it had been uploaded simultaneously to Interpol's Seoul liaison, the Korean Financial Intelligence Unit, and the inboxes of 2 investigative journalists, one at a Korean financial daily, one at an international outlet, who were known, specifically, for not being buyable. By noon, both journalists had confirmed the documents were authentic. By evening, 3 of the Kang Group's board members had quietly contacted their personal attorneys. Minsok sat in his office at 9 p.m. and looked at his phone and felt the specific cold of a man who has built something and is watching it develop cracks he cannot locate. He called a private meeting. Just the 3 brothers, no staff. He said, "We have a leak." Hyunwoo said, "I'll find it." Do-yoon said nothing. He sat at the end of the table and looked at his hands. Hyunwoo's arrangement with Minister Choi Dae-jung collapsed on a Friday. The minister arrived at his office to find a package on his desk. No sender, no postage. It had been placed there by someone who had accessed a government building on a Thursday evening when the minister was at a dinner. The building's security footage showed nothing because the camera covering that corridor had experienced a 12-minute technical failure at 8:43 p.m. Inside the package were 41 pages of documentation, payment records, communication logs, shipment manifests linking the Kang Group's Busan logistics operation to the movement of restricted cargo through Incheon port over a period of 3 years. And a photograph of the minister, in a room he would not want anyone to know he'd been in. The minister called his personal attorney before he called anyone else. His attorney called a prosecutor's office 2 days later. The minister's cooperation agreement was signed within a week. His first interview with prosecutors lasted 6 hours. He named Hyun-woo in the first 30 minutes. Hyun-woo did not sleep well after that. He started going over the building's security logs himself, looking for the leak. He ordered sweeps of all the executive offices. The sweep team found nothing. They were looking for external intrusion, devices planted by outsiders. It didn't occur to anyone to look inside the base of a desk phone. It didn't occur to anyone to check the ventilation plate above the credenza. The signal duplicator under the laptop charging station went undetected for 6 weeks. He started going through the building staff rosters. He looked at the list of maintenance and cleaning personnel who had access to the executive floors and found 43 names. He flagged 17 for background checks. Zaraya's name was on the list. Her background check came back clean. She had no criminal record, no known affiliations. She was the widow of the company's former chairman, working a night shift job in the building her late husband built. The investigator who processed her file made a note that read, "No security concern identified," and moved on. Madam Kang came to the building on a Tuesday. She did not call ahead. She came at 2 p.m., when she knew Zaraya would be in the building for a mandatory staff health and safety briefing, a quarterly requirement that all building staff attended in person. Zaraya was in the lobby when Madam Kang arrived. She was in her gray uniform. Her cart was beside her. She'd been cleaning the glass panels by the main entrance. Madam Kang sat down in one of the lobby's low chairs, the kind reserved for visitors waiting for escorts, and crossed her legs and looked at Zaraya the way a woman looks at something that has outlasted its usefulness. She said, "You look well." Zaraya said, "Madam Kang." "I was in the area," Madam Kang said. "I thought I'd see how you were managing." "I'm managing fine." "Good." Madam Kang smoothed her skirt. "It couldn't have been easy, the adjustment." Zaraya said nothing. She picked up her cloth and went back to the glass panel. Madam Kang watched her for a moment and then said, "I want to offer you something, an arrangement. There's a settlement figure that the estate attorneys have been authorized to discuss. It's significant. Enough for a house in Lilongwe, a comfortable life. Your family would benefit." Zaraya didn't turn around. "I'm not interested in a settlement." "Zaraya?" Madam Kang's voice shifted, not softer, more precise. "You are a young woman in a foreign country with no income, no legal standing in the estate, and no allies. I'm offering you an exit that has dignity in it. I would think carefully before declining." Zaraya turned around then. She looked at Madam Kang with an expression that was completely neutral and said, "Thank you for coming." Madam Kang looked at her for a moment. Something moved behind her eyes. Not quite worry, but adjacent to it. She stood, smoothed her coat, and said, "The offer has a time limit. Think about it." She left. Zaraya watched her go through the glass doors. She waited until the car had pulled away from the curb. Then she reached into the pocket of her uniform and pressed a button on a small device no larger than a key fob. 3 weeks earlier, during a routine maintenance visit that Zaraya had arranged through the building's facilities manager using a request form she'd submitted in her second week, a team from the building's external cleaning contractor had detailed Madam Kang's car. The car was in the building's private parking facility for 4 hours that day, while Madam Kang attended a board lunch. The device Zaraya pressed confirmed that the listening unit placed under the rear passenger seat was still transmitting. She picked up her cloth and went back to the glass. That night, at 11 p.m., she pushed her cart into the service corridor and retrieved the encrypted phone from beneath the cleaning supplies. She put in an earpiece and played back the previous 3 days of recordings from Madam Kang's car. Most of it was ordinary. Staff calls, a conversation with her personal physician, a long call to a friend about a vacation property. On the third day's recording, at 4:17 p.m., Madam Kang had been on the phone with Min-sok for 11 minutes. Zaraya listened to the whole thing twice. Near the end of the call, Madam Kang said, "The prosecutor's office is moving faster than we thought. The minister gave them more than we anticipated." Min-sok said, "I'm handling it." Madam Kang said, "You need to handle the other thing as well. I don't want loose ends." A pause. Min-sok said, "Which loose end?" Madam Kang said, "The foreign one. Still in the building. It was a mistake letting her stay." A silence. Min-sok said, "What do you want me to do?" Madam Kang said, "I want the problem resolved. I don't care how. I don't want another package on another desk." Zaraya pulled the earpiece out. She sat in the service corridor for a moment, with her hands on her knees. Then she took out the encrypted phone and dialed Emmanuel Diallo's number. When he picked up, she said, "Move the timeline up. I need the full team ready in 30 days. Diallo said, "Understood." She said, "And Emmanuel. Tell them to bring enough vehicles." Do-yoon found her 2 days later. He'd been watching her for a week. He came to the building after midnight, told the security desk he'd forgotten something in his office, and went down to the basement level instead of up. He found her in the corridor outside the filing archive at 1:30 a.m. He stepped in front of her cart. She stopped. He looked terrible. He hadn't been sleeping. His suit was from yesterday, Zaraya could tell from the slight crease at the collar, and his eyes had the specific flatness of a man who had spent too many nights doing the math on a decision he couldn't unmake. He said, "I need to talk to you." She said, "Do-yoon." Min-sok knows the ghost is connected to someone internal. He doesn't know who yet, but he's close. He has a security analyst who's been cross-referencing the timing of the leaks with building access logs. Zaraya said, "How long?" "Days. Maybe a week." He swallowed. "They're also planning something for Jae-min." She said, "Jae-min is dead." He looked at her, just looked at her. He said, "Zaraya." She said nothing. He said, "Min-sok got a report 2 weeks ago from a private investigator he hired in Busan. There's a man matching Jae-min's build who's been seen near a private facility outside the city. Different face. But the way he moves." Do-yoon shook his head. "Min-sok showed me the photographs. I told him it was nothing. He didn't believe me." Zaraya looked at him steadily. Do-yoon said, "You need to get out, both of you. Whatever you're doing, whatever he's doing, it's time to stop and go." Zaraya said, "Thank you, Do-yoon." He said, "Zaraya, I'm serious." "I know you are," she said. "Thank you." She moved her cart around him and continued down the corridor. Do-yoon stood there watching her go. He understood, standing in that corridor at 1:30 in the morning, that he had just walked into a room where the furniture had already been arranged for something he hadn't been told about. He took the elevator up to his office. He sat in the dark for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and called a number that was not his brother's. Outside Busan, 40 minutes from the city, there was a facility that didn't appear on any commercial property listing. It had been a private medical rehabilitation center 15 years ago. It closed when its primary investor lost everything in a real estate collapse, and the building sat empty for a decade before Sung Jin acquired it through a holding company registered in the name of a man who had been dead for 4 years. Inside, on the second floor, in a room with no windows on the exterior wall, Kang Jae-min watched his brother's empire disintegrate across 6 monitors. He was 38 years old and looked older and younger than that simultaneously. The reconstructive surgery had changed the line of his nose and the shape of his jaw enough that he could walk through a public space without triggering recognition, but his eyes were the same, still and dark and giving nothing away to anyone who didn't know how to read them. Sung Jin knew how. The 7 other people in the facility knew how. Nobody else. He had been here for 22 months. He didn't think of it as hiding. He thought of it as positioning. There was a difference, and the difference mattered to him in the way that precision mattered to him in everything, because imprecision was how people he respected had died. The 6 monitors showed him real-time financial data from 3 of the brothers' accounts he'd maintained shadow access to, encrypted intercepts from the communication channels he'd personally built and therefore knew the back doors of, a running log of the ghost's operations he had not planned. That last part had taken him 2 weeks to accept. In the early months after the explosion, he had assumed the ghost's work was coming from Sung Jin's network. He'd designed some operations himself, passed them through channels, watched them land. But the ghost's pace had outrun his. The targeting was more precise than anything he'd directed. The evidence packages that destroyed David Shen, the ones that broke Minister Choi, the ones that caused 3 board members to call their lawyers on the same afternoon, those were not his work. He figured it out on a Thursday night in February, when Sung Jin came in and put a photograph on the desk. Security footage, pulled from a camera that the brothers' sweep team had checked but that Zariah hadn't known existed, a maintenance camera in the building's east service corridor, angled to cover the electrical panel, that caught, at the edge of its frame, a woman in gray overalls pushing a cart past the doorway of the archive room at 12:47 a.m. The camera quality was poor, but the way she carried herself, that specific combination of unhurried and completely aware, was not something Jae-min needed a clear image to identify. He sat in front of that photograph for a long time. Sung Jin said, "She's been running her own network out of the building for at least 6 months. We've been able to identify at least 4 operatives she's working with externally. One of them is Emmanuel Diallo." Jae-min said, "General Cole's man." "Yes, sir," Jae-min said. "She recruited her father's people." "It appears so." He was quiet. He looked at the monitor showing the ghost's operation log. All that precision, all that patience. She was inside the building every night, building a case that no defense attorney on Earth would be able to dismantle, while simultaneously feeding intelligence to an external network that was systematically eliminating every piece of the brothers' criminal infrastructure. He had given her the keys thinking he was protecting her. She had used them to start a war. He said, "Does she know I'm alive?" Sung Jin paused long enough that Jae-min looked at him. Sung Jin said, "We believe so, sir. We think she identified the Busan facility approximately 3 months after the funeral. There's a payment record in the offshore logs, the surgeon's facility, which is structured as a medical equipment company, that she would have found when she first accessed the network." Jae-min said, "And she said nothing." "No, sir." He looked back at the photograph. He understood. If she had contacted him, Min-suk's people would have eventually detected it. If the brothers believed, even suspected, that Jae-min was alive, they would have pulled back, retreated into defensive positions. Every traitor, every corrupt partner, every person who had helped or enabled the assassination would have gone to ground. By letting them believe he was dead, by saying nothing, by pushing her cart through the corridors every night with her eyes down, she had kept every one of them exposed, comfortable, moving around in the open, making decisions, revealing themselves. She had used his absence as bait, and she had been right to do it. He picked up the photograph. He folded it once. He put it in his chest pocket. He said, "Pull Sung Jin's field team back. Whatever timeline they're on, adjust it to match hers. She's further ahead than we are." Min-suk found him on a Wednesday. The security analyst's cross-referencing had worked, not through the building, through Busan. The private investigator's photographs, combined with a transaction trace that Min-suk's financial team ran on the offshore account structure, produced a location. 40 minutes outside the city. Hyun-woo took 12 men. They moved at 11 p.m. on a Wednesday, when the facility's external monitors showed minimal movement. They came in through the north access road. They found Jae-min in a ground-floor room. He was alone. 2 of his people had been outside. They were restrained first. Inside, there were the monitors, the equipment, the evidence of 22 months of careful, patient work. Hyun-woo looked around the room for a long time. He said, "You've been busy." Jae-min didn't answer. They zip-tied his wrists and put him in an SUV and drove him back to Seoul, to the steel factory. Min-suk sat across from him on the backwards chair and looked at the screens behind his eyes and felt afraid in a way he hadn't expected, and covered it, and asked him where he'd been, and Jae-min said nothing, and Min-suk stood and walked to the window and talked about Zariah mopping the floors. Then Jae-min said, "Check your watch." Min-suk checked it. 1:14 a.m. The engines outside were getting louder. Min-suk turned to Hyun-woo and said, "What is that?" Hyun-woo was already moving to the window. He looked out. He went very still. He said, "Vehicles." Min-suk said, "How many?" Hyun-woo didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "A lot. They came from both directions. North Access Road, South Access Road. 2 vehicles blocking the only vehicle exit to the east. The factory sat in a dead zone between an industrial park and a freight depot, the kind of location chosen specifically because nothing happened there and no one came at night. Tonight, everything came at night." Hyun-woo pulled his gun. His 12 men moved to the doors. One of them said something into a radio and got silence back. The 2 men they'd left outside as perimeter weren't answering. The factory's main doors were large enough to drive a truck through, and they opened inward. When they came apart, the first vehicle inside was a black SUV with its lights on. It stopped. The door opened. The man who got out was in his late 50s, compact, moving with the kind of economy that comes from decades of being in situations where wasted motion cost lives. He was wearing a tactical vest over a plain jacket. He had a radio in one hand, and a look on his face that wasn't hostile so much as entirely certain. Hyun-woo didn't recognize him. Min-suk didn't recognize him. Neither of them would have. Park Sung-jin had been Jae-min's operative for 19 years and had spent those years being exactly the kind of person whose name didn't appear on anything. Behind him, through the open factory doors, the headlights of a dozen more vehicles were visible. And then they came in on foot. Not soldiers. Not in any uniform Hyun-woo's men had seen. A man in his 40s in work clothes who moved like someone used to being responsible for other people's safety, Jae-min's lead driver for 11 years. 2 women and a man from the executive floor kitchen who had been reassigned to a subsidiary office in the brothers' restructuring and had spent 6 months being underestimated and angry about it. An accountant who had worked in the Kang Group's Singapore office, who knew where every number was buried because he had buried some of them himself, and who had received a phone call from an unknown number 8 months ago and said yes without hesitating. Security guards who had transferred paperwork to the building management division on the brothers' instruction and who had spent every day since watching the brothers' men work and memorizing what they saw. Former military contractors. 3 men who had done private security work on Kang Group logistics routes and whose contracts were terminated in the first month of the brothers' administration, their pensions reduced by 40% through a clause the brothers' lawyers had inserted, and the men hadn't known to look for. They had received calls, separately, from an encrypted number. A woman's voice, a direct question, an offer that was less about money than about what they still believed in. They all said yes. They came through the factory doors in a line that didn't break. Hyun-woo looked at all of them. He said, to no one in particular, "What is this?" From behind the last vehicle, through the open doors, a figure appeared in the headlights. Black coat, no hurry, flat shoes on the concrete floor. Her head up, her hands at her sides, her face carrying the same expression she had worn in a lobby chair in front of his dropped uniform, in a living room while he outlined the terms of her humiliation, in a corridor while Madame Kang offered her a settlement. Completely, permanently, dangerously still. Zariah walked through the middle of it all like she had built this room too. She stopped in front of Kang Jae-min. He looked up at her. His eye was swollen. The cut on his jaw had opened again. He was zip-tied to a bolted chair. She looked at him for a moment. Then she turned to Sung-jin, who had moved behind the chair, and Sung-jin produced a knife and cut the zip ties. Jae-min stood. He rolled his wrists. He looked at his wife. He said, "You knew." She said, "I found the surgeon's payment in the offshore logs, 14 weeks after the funeral." He said, "And you didn't. If I reached out to you, Min-suk's surveillance would eventually find it. And if they found it, everyone who helped them goes underground. I needed them comfortable. I needed them making decisions in the open where I could see them." Jae-min was quiet. She said, "I needed to know everyone who moved against you, not just the ones who planned it. Everyone who knew and said nothing. Everyone who helped and thought no one was watching." She looked at the brothers. "I needed them all in the same light." Jae-min said, "You used my death as a net." She said, "I used their arrogance as a net. Your death was just the opening." He looked at her for a long time. He said, "You're terrifying." She said, "I know." Min-suk made one last move. He was the strategist. Even now, in the factory, surrounded, he was running calculations. He looked at Zaraya's assembled army, drivers and cleaners and accountants and soldiers, and he made a decision. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. He held it up. He said, "I have a 45-second window to send a message. In that message is a file that goes to my attorneys and to 3 journalists. That file contains evidence that Zaraya Cole coordinated corporate espionage within the Kang Group, impersonated a staff member to access restricted areas, and conducted unauthorized surveillance of company executives." He paused. "It won't destroy her, but it will tie her up in courts for 5 years. It will undermine everything you've built tonight." Zaraya looked at him. She said, "Send it." Min-suk paused. She said, "Send it, Min-suk. Send it to your attorneys. Send it to the journalists. Send it to whoever you want." He looked at her. She reached into her coat and produced her own phone. She pulled up a screen and turned it toward him. It was a message thread, time-stamped 3 hours ago, showing a document package already delivered to the lead prosecutor on the Kang financial investigation, to Interpol's Seoul office, to the same journalists Min-suk's file was going to, and to financial regulatory bodies in Singapore, Dubai, and Zurich. She said, "By the time anyone reads what you're sending, they'll have been reading what I sent for 3 hours. Every transaction, every communication, every offshore account, every name." She lowered the phone. "Whatever you just sent is a footnote." Min-suk looked at the phone in his hand. He put it back in his pocket. Hyun-woo tried to run. He made for a side door, the kind of impulse decision that men like him made when the math stopped working. He got 12 feet before 2 of the former military contractors had him on the floor. He didn't struggle for long. There wasn't much point. Do-yoon didn't move. He stood where he'd been standing since the vehicles arrived and looked at Zaraya with an expression she understood. Not quite guilt, not quite relief, something between them that had no clean name. He said, "I warned you." She said, "You did." He said, "That wasn't enough, was it?" She said, "It helped me know your timeline. That mattered." He nodded slowly. He put his hands in his pockets. He said, "What happens now?" Zaraya said, "The same thing that always happens when evidence reaches the right people. Process, attorneys, courts." She paused. "Your cooperation will be noted." Do-yoon looked at her. He said, "I'm sorry. For what it's worth, I should have." "Do-yoon," she said, "stand over there, please." He moved to where she indicated. He stood there quietly. Sungjin's people had already called the vehicles around. The brothers' 12 men were contained. Phones were being collected. The night was moving fast now, the way nights do when the planning is over and the execution begins. Jae-min stood beside Zaraya. He said quietly, "Madam Kang." Zaraya said, "Already handled." He looked at her. She said, "The audio recording from her car is with the prosecutor's office. It arrived 2 hours ago." He was quiet. She said, "I told you, I labeled that file last." Madam Kang was at the Grand Hyatt Seoul. She attended the annual gala for the Seoul Cultural Foundation every year. She had chaired the event for a decade. The room was full of the city's old money, the families whose names appeared on hospital wings and university buildings, people who had known Madam Kang since before her second marriage, who had watched her move from the wife of a wealthy man to the mother of an empire. She was in her finest. Pearl earrings. A navy gown that had been fitted in Paris 3 months ago. She was at the head table, between a former cabinet minister and the director of a major art foundation, and she was in the middle of a sentence about the foundation's upcoming exhibition when the doors opened. The 2 men who came in were not wearing tuxedos. They had credentials instead. They moved through the room without raising their voices, which was almost worse. The quiet of it, the deliberate professionalism. The room noticed before Madam Kang did. She became aware of it through the faces across from her going very still, through the conversation at her table stopping mid-sentence, through the former cabinet minister finding something to look at on the far wall. She put her wine glass down. She turned. The lead prosecutor's office had sent a senior investigator she had never met, which told her this was not going to be something that could be managed with a phone call to the right person. She had managed many things with phone calls to the right people over the course of her life. The look on this man's face said that those lines were no longer available. She stood. because she would not be pulled to her feet in this room, in front of these people, in this dress. The investigator said her name. He said she was being taken in for questioning in connection with conspiracy, financial fraud, and a charge she had not expected to hear out loud in a sentence directed at her. She said, very quietly, "This is a mistake." He said, "Yes, ma'am. You can tell us about it when we get there." She walked out of the room herself. No one touched her. She held her posture all the way across the floor, past the tables of people she had known for 40 years, people whose faces she could not bring herself to look at directly. At the door, she turned once. The room was watching, every person in it, the people she had impressed and performed for and cultivated over 4 decades, watching her leave between 2 investigators on a Thursday night in a Paris gown. Her composure, the armor she had maintained every day of her adult life, held to the door. It didn't hold past it. Min-suk was arrested at the factory, processed, transported. He said nothing during processing. Nothing in the car, nothing in the first interview. His attorney arrived within an hour. A very good attorney, one of the best in Seoul, the kind you retain when you operate at the level Min-suk operated at. The attorney asked for time with his client, and was given it. Inside the interview room, alone with his client, the attorney opened his briefcase and laid the prosecution's evidence file on the table. He looked at it for a moment, then he looked at Min-suk. He said, "How much of this did you know she had?" Min-suk said, "None of it." The attorney nodded slowly. He closed the file. He said, "I'll do what I can." Min-suk looked at the table. He was thinking about the lobby, about Zaraya in her gray uniform, pushing her cart through the marble floors, about how many times he had walked past her and registered nothing, not threat, not intelligence, not anything except the background texture of a building operating normally. He thought about the day they had dropped the uniform on the coffee table, how certain they had been, how completely, catastrophically certain. He said, to no one in particular, "We made her invisible." The attorney didn't respond. There was nothing useful to say. Hyun-woo cooperated within 12 hours. Not out of guilt. Out of calculation, the same thing that had driven every decision he'd ever made. The evidence was airtight. The minister was already cooperating. David Shen was cooperating. Half the people in his network had been either arrested or were in the process of negotiating their own arrangements. He gave the prosecutors names, dates, account numbers, the location of 3 additional offshore accounts that even Min-suk didn't know about. He gave them everything. It didn't matter. The prosecution had most of it already. His cooperation reduced his exposure by a margin that his attorney described as meaningful, and Hyun-woo nodded and understood that meaningful was not the same as enough. Do-yoon surrendered himself at 9 a.m. the morning after the factory. He walked into the Seoul Central District Prosecutor's office alone, without an attorney, and told the receptionist his name and said he was there to cooperate fully with the investigation into the Kang Group and that he would like to speak to whoever was leading it. They put him in a room for 40 minutes before anyone came. He sat there without his phone, without anything to read, and thought about the series of small decisions that had led him to a chair in a government building at 9 in the morning. He thought about the conference table where the 3 brothers had decided. He thought about his own silence. Not just at the table, for the years before it. Every time Min-suk spoke and he nodded. Every time Hyun-woo did something brutal and Do-yoon looked away. The accumulation of it. He thought about Zaraya in the corridor at 1:30 a.m., the way she had thanked him and moved her cart around him and continued. And he understood now what he'd seen in her face then. Not fear, not gratitude, not urgency. Just a woman who had already accounted for him, who had put him in the right position on a board she'd been managing for months. His cooperation was complete and detailed, and ultimately sufficient to significantly reduce his sentence. He was the only Kang brother who cooperated without an attorney present. The prosecutor noted it. It mattered later. The Kang Group board met in emergency session on a Monday morning, 11 days after the factory. Half the seats were empty. 3 members had resigned. 2 were under their own investigation. The ones who remained were men who had managed to keep their hands clean enough that a lawyer could make the argument, and several of them had lawyers making precisely that argument. Jae-min was not in the room when the session began. He arrived at 9:47 a.m., 17 minutes late. No announcement. He walked in, took a seat at the side of the table, not the head, the side, and said, "Let's get through the procedural items first." The procedural items took 90 minutes. Asset reviews, legal exposure mapping, communication with regulators, the kind of granular, joyless work that corporate catastrophe produces. At 11:23 a.m., when the procedural items were done, Jae-min stood. He said, "The company needs a leader. Not a caretaker, a leader who understands what this organization is, what it did, and what it needs to become to survive the next 5 years." He paused. "I'm not that person." The room was very quiet. He said, "I built this company on systems and networks that should not exist. I know where every piece of it is. I know how it was designed. That knowledge makes me the wrong person to lead its reconstruction, because everyone in this room, and everyone outside it, will spend the next decade waiting for me to return to what I built." He looked at the table. A company trying to become legitimate cannot be led by the architect of its illegitimacy. He said, "I'm recommending the board appoint a new chairman, someone who came to this organization from the outside, someone whose record is unambiguous, someone who has, over the past several months, demonstrated a comprehensive understanding of this company's structures at every level." He paused, "and whose judgment I trust without reservation." He walked to the head of the table. He pulled the chair out. He stepped back. He said, "I'd like to introduce the board to its new chairman." She walked in without announcement. No pause at the door, no scan of the room to gauge the temperature of it. Zariah Cole walked to the head of the Kang Group boardroom table, like she had already spent a year thinking about what she would do when she got there, which she had, and sat down. She opened the folder in front of her. She looked up. The board members looked back. These were not soft men. The ones who remained after the arrests and the resignations were people who had survived in a difficult industry for a long time by reading situations accurately and adjusting. They were adjusting now. In the row of chairs behind the main table, the secondary seating, where advisors and division heads sat, several men were present who had not been in this room before. A man in his late 50s with a background that did not appear on any corporate filing. Sung-jin, who had been Jae-min's operative for 19 years, and who was now, in this new structure, head of security. Beside him, 3 people who had spent the past 8 months gathering evidence in parking facilities, and service corridors, and encrypted server rooms. And in the far corner of the room, quiet and still, Emmanuel Diallo, 61 years old, General Isaac Cole's man. He had not been introduced. He did not need to be. Zariah looked at the board. She said, "I'm going to tell you what the next 6 months look like, and then we're going to talk about the next 3 years. The regulatory engagement alone will require daily management. The asset restructuring in Singapore and Dubai is time-sensitive. We have a 90-day window before the freeze becomes permanent, and I've already been in communication with the relevant authorities about a compliance framework that could preserve 60% of those assets under legitimate structures." She turned a page. The company's legitimate arms, real estate, the security contracts, the logistics network, are viable. They are profitable. They are staffed by people who came to work here in good faith and whose careers should not be casualties of decisions made above them. She paused. They won't be. A board member in his 60s, a man named Shin who had been on the board for 12 years and whose loyalty to whoever sat at the head of the table was the most consistent thing about him, said, "With respect, Chairman, the legal exposure from the estate proceedings alone," Zariah said, "is already being addressed. My legal team has been in preliminary discussions with the estate attorneys for 3 weeks. I anticipated this session." Shin said, "You anticipated?" 3 weeks ago, yes. She looked at him steadily. "I've also reviewed your individual contract with the board. Your renewal is in 4 months. I'd suggest you decide before then whether this is a table you want to remain at." Shin said nothing further. Zariah turned another page. Jae-min watched from the corridor. There was a window in the boardroom door, a long, thin panel of glass, and he stood beside it and watched her work the room, and the thing he felt was not pride exactly, though it was close. It was something more like recognition, like watching a person do precisely the thing they were built to do. Sung-jin came up beside him after a while. He said, "How long do you stay?" Jae-min said, "Few more months. Until the legal restructuring is stable, and the regulatory process has a clear track." Sung-jin said, "And then?" Jae-min said, "Then she doesn't need me here." Sung-jin was quiet. Jae-min said, "She never did, if we're being honest." The weeks that followed were the kind of weeks that looked like nothing from the outside, and were everything from the inside. Zaraya was in the office by 7 every morning. She was the last one out most nights. She met with prosecutors and regulators and attorneys and division heads, and the kind of people whose names appeared in news reports about corporate reform, and she was the same in every room, direct, prepared, completely uninterested in performing confidence, because she had no need to perform it. The staff who had watched her push a cleaning cart through the building and looked through her, most of them stayed. A few left. The ones who stayed were quietly grateful in the way people are when a situation resolves in a direction they couldn't bring themselves to hope for. The woman who had handed Zaraya a key to the staff lockers on her first night, a woman in her 40s named Park Ji-young who had been with the building management division for 9 years, passed her in the corridor one morning and stopped. She said, "I didn't know." Zaraya said, "I know you didn't." Ji-young said, I thought." Zaraya said, "Ji-young, you were kind to me when you didn't have to be. That's what I remember." Ji-young nodded. She went back to her desk. She worked there for 3 more years. Madam Kang's trial lasted 8 months. The audio recording from the car was admitted into evidence in the 6th week. Her attorney challenged its admissibility 3 times. The challenge failed each time, on 3 different grounds, by 3 different judges. The recording was 11 minutes and 43 seconds long. The prosecution played it in full. The courtroom was very quiet. Madam Kang sat through it with her spine straight and her face arranged into something that had once been composure and was now only its shape. She looked at no one during the playback. Her hands were folded in her lap. When the recording ended, the room stayed quiet for a moment longer than was usual. The verdict came on a Thursday afternoon: conspiracy, accessory to attempted murder, financial fraud. She was convicted on all counts. She was 64 years old at sentencing. Her attorney argued for leniency on the basis of age and the absence of a prior record. The judge noted the premeditation, the duration, and the involvement of a family member, and declined to exercise leniency. Madam Kang was taken from the courtroom with her spine still straight, which was the only thing she had left that was entirely hers. None of her sons were in the courtroom. Jae-min was not there. He had considered it. He had decided that he had already spent enough of his life thinking about her. Min-suk received the heaviest sentence of the 3 brothers. He served 4 years before health complications resulted in a transfer to a medical facility, and he died in that facility 18 months later, at 51 years old, from a cardiac event. The obituary in the financial press was 3 paragraphs. It noted his role in the Kang Group's operations and the circumstances of his conviction. It did not mention Zaraya. Hyun-woo was released after 3 years and left Korea. He was last reported to be living in Thailand under his own name, which suggested either that he believed his time in the criminal world was genuinely over, or that he had become worse at concealment. His former associates had no particular interest in finding out which. Do-yoon served 18 months. When he was released, he did not return to Seoul. He moved to Jeju Island, where his wife's family had a small fishing operation. He worked there. He didn't speak to the press. He didn't write a book. He didn't attempt to rehabilitate a public image. 2 years after his release, he received a letter. Single page, no letterhead, the handwriting he recognized. The letter said, "You warned me when you didn't have to. I remembered that. I hope the island is treating you well." It was not signed. It didn't need to be. 1 year after the boardroom session, the Kang Group was restructured under a new corporate identity, a clean name, registered with full regulatory disclosure, its legitimate operations separated into 3 distinct legal entities. Its compliance framework cited twice in Korean financial press as a model for post-crisis reconstruction. The chairman's photograph appeared in a business magazine profile in the spring. She was photographed in her office, the corner office, Seoul's skyline behind her. No styling cues toward power, no deliberate positioning. She was sitting at her desk in a dark blazer, a file open in front of her, looking at the camera like the camera had interrupted something she intended to get back to. The profile was titled, The Architect. It ran for 12 pages. It covered her legal career, her background, her marriage, the events of the past 3 years. It was thorough. It was accurate. The journalist had requested an interview with Kang Jae-min for context. The request was declined. A spokesperson noted that he was not involved in the company's current operations. On the evening the profile published, Zaraya was in the office until 8. When she left, Jae-min was in the lobby. He was in a jacket and dark trousers, no tie. He looked like a man with a dinner reservation and no particular agenda beyond it. Thingthemation and no particular agenda. She said, You saw the profile. He said, I saw the profile. She said, The photograph is too formal. He said, The photograph is perfect. They walked out together into a Seoul evening that was ordinary and cool and full of the sound of a city going about its business, indifferent to the two of them and the thing they had survived. She said, What did you do today? He said, Nothing important. She said, Jae-min. He said, I walked. I read. I had lunch by myself at a place in Mapo that you'd find unremarkable. She said, I'd like to try it. He said, Saturday. She said, Saturday. They turned left at the corner. Seoul kept moving around them. 300 miles away, in an office in a building with no signage, a man in a dark suit was ending a call. He set his phone on the desk. In front of him was the magazine profile. He had read it twice. He had also read the prosecution files, the full versions, not the redacted ones, that a contact had obtained through channels that did not officially exist. He set the magazine down. He said, to the only other person in the room, a woman who had been standing by the window looking at nothing. She built a surveillance and intelligence operation inside a hostile corporate building. She ran it solo for 8 months without being detected. She recruited a field network of civilians with no operational background and turned them into something that held together under live conditions. The woman by the window said nothing. He said, She has her father's training, her father's discipline, and something her father never had. She can operate in institutional settings, boardrooms, legal frameworks, corporate structures. She moves between worlds. The woman said, And the husband? He said, The husband stepped back. A pause. She said, She let him? He said, She didn't have to stop him. He understood the situation himself. The woman turned from the window. She said, What do you want to do? The man picked up his phone again. He said, I want to make an introduction. I want to put something in front of her, something large enough that the Kang group looks like a warm-up. The woman said, And if she says no? The man looked at the magazine profile on his desk. The photograph. Zaraya at her desk, looking at the camera like it had interrupted something she intended to get back to. He said, Then we'll have learned something important about her judgment. He dialed. The line rang twice. A voice answered, composed, unhurried, the voice of a woman in a corner office in Seoul who had already had a long day and was not finished with it. He said, Ms. Cole, my name won't mean anything to you yet, but I believe we have a mutual interest, and I think you'll want to hear what I'm about to tell you. A brief pause on the line. Then Zaraya Cole said, You have 5 minutes. Make them count. If this story hit different, if Zaraya had you from the janitor's cart to that final phone call, then like this video, drop a comment telling me your favorite moment, and subscribe.